Hey, Jeanette.
Hi, Mama. I don't see you.
I'm turning myself on.
Oh,
Hold
I see you.
on, I'm making myself you. I'm making myself.
Okay. Let
Okay.
me see.
So
Okay.
they're on. Hold on. I'm gonna find them.
What are you looking for, Mama? Oh, there's four.
Um. Yeah. I'm making Grace. Okay. So everyone should be. I think. So I made them both presenters.
I think it's going to show you my screen.
Hmm?
Can y'all hear me?
I hear
Yeah.
you.
Okay. There we
Is it okay?
go.
So does hi Grace.
Hey
So does
guys,
the camera on?
my computer is dead. Now, how dumb was that?
Hey,
Oh,
Hey.
I
hi.
hear Sue.
Oh, good.
Yeah, I
I
can
don't.
hear you.
Great. As you can tell, my voice is really great tonight.
Oh,
Well, Mama,
I
that
don't.
means
I
you
don't
must have been
see
doing
you,
too much
Sue.
talking.
Y- Yeah, yeah.
I know,
So
right?
I'm actually sitting in my living room using my tablet instead of my computer. Do you mind? But it doesn't have a webcam.
Oh, that's
Oh, that's fun.
Sue. Do whatever you got to do.
Okay, so you can hear me, and I can hear
Hmm.
Yeah.
everybody,
Hmm.
but you
Hmm.
can't see me. And I can see all of you, however.
All right
Huh.
then.
Do you have a tablet with no camera, Sue?
Well, you know what? It does have a camera, but when I try to put it on, it says no webcam.
Hmm.
That is
Stop recording. Like,
faces. Welcome to our fourth webinar with Justice for Families. This webinar today it's really going to be amazing. Um, the topic is nuts and bolts of organizing. Who got the power? And sometimes we feel like we don't have any influence, no power, but we're gonna get some tools this evening on how to share that power and how we can become influence with those who make decisions. So it's going to be an amazing webinar. For those who don't know me, I'm Janet Bocanegra. I am the director of family partnership with Justice for Families. Justice for Families is an organization that's run by families impacted by the juvenile justice system. And just a few housekeeping rules. The webinar is going to be for 60 minutes. We usually have it for an hour and 30 minutes, but we're keeping it to 60 minutes with Q&A at the end. The webinar will be recorded. We'll be able to share the recording on a later date. So if you're interested, please shoot us an email. And everyone is muted, but there's a chat box on the right side of your computer, and you can type in any questions or any concerns that you may have in reference to the webinar. Next slide. Nuts and bolts of organizing, part one. Who's got the power? From 8 to 8:15. We'll have an overview of families and the information of the webinar. We have an amazing special guest today, Serena Ligori. And from 8:45 to 9, some Q&A. Next slide. Justice for Families, the next one. Justice for Family has two main goals, and the main goals are to transform how the justice system has been treating young people and families, and transform um, how it's been operating for generations. Number two is reinvest those resources that have been in incarcerating young people and not providing the right support, and just investing, direct investment in communities and families. Next slide. And our three core strategies is leadership development, providing the families with those tools to be an effective leader, that peer support. We know how difficult it can be to have a loved one incarcerated. It has a stigma. Families do understand when you're walking that walk, when you're navigating that system, which is a nightmare. Having that person that can really relate to some of those issues and needs that we have, and share leadership environment, how to develop those learning environments in our community, strategic partnership alliance, making those connections, providing technical assistance, whether for families or with juvenile justice systems. Sometimes they don't know. It's just been the way they've been working. So even how to transform the way juvenile justice corrections have been operating with families. And the main one, which is kind of geared to what we're doing today, doing policy advocacy, how to do that external and internal work, how to move those resources to where it's really needed, and how to have the family, the voice, being in front of that wheel, in front of the vehicle. So we do provide leadership development for families. We do the internal organizing. One of the second webinar that we facilitated was more, how do you advocate for your loved one? That one-on-one advocacy. And we know that when we look at the bigger picture, it's not only about our family. If it's not good for us and it's not good for our children, it's not good for my neighbor's children. It's not good for my nieces, my nephews, my neighbor's kids. So we do have to take this advocacy to a level where changes are made in systems overall, not just here in New York where I'm at, but across the country, where we have folks that register from across the country, Alaska, Missouri, Tacoma, Washington. So those issues that are affecting communities and families, we do have to do the external organizing to make change. Next slide. And this map here just represents folks from across the country that have registered to even learn about what's happening. If it's happening in my home, it could happen somewhere else. So how can we as a community, and this is not a small community in New York, but a community in the whole United States, how can we connect with each other to make sure that the injustice that's been happening to our young people and our loved ones that have been impacted by incarceration, how can we make those changes and how can we support each other? Next slide. And we know that we're not just here to learn, and we're not just here to say, I don't have nothing else to do, so let me just watch this webinar. Everyone that's registered had a loved one in the juvenile justice system or in the adult side. There's folks that are on this webinar that are working tirelessly to make changes in the adult side, in the juvenile side, and now we all are feeling with what's going on with the immigration and those young people and families that are being disconnected. People that work in the system that do know and understand that reform needs to be changed and made. And folks who have themselves experienced incarceration. So we have a variety of participants that are here to share, to learn, and to even receive that peer-to-peer support. And I'm gonna now hand it over to an amazing, amazing woman. When I learned about Serena Lagori, I was like, oh my gosh, she's doing amazing work. How many folks are dedicating their time, their efforts to really supporting women, young girls that are impacted by the system? This is one population that sometimes is forgotten. So Serena, I want to thank you. Serena is the executive director. Go back, Serena. Go back. First page. Serena's the executive director for New Hour for Women and Children in Long Island. And Serena's going to share some strategies that she used that we also spoke about in our advocacy training. So Serena, thank you. I'm going to shut my camera off and hand it over to you. And I'm sweating because you don't know.
Thank you, Jeanette, and it's a pleasure and an honor to be here with everyone tonight. When Jeanette first approached me to talk about this, one of the things that came to mind for me is when I was incarcerated, I was 21, and when I came back after incarceration home to Long Island, there were no resources. There was very little, and there was a lot of stigma and shame. And that's something that we're looking to furiously work on here. And I know throughout the nation, there's been a real call to action. And I'm so excited to be a part of this, this webinar and this community of folks who've been either directly impacted or are impactful in terms of the system. So I'm actually going to hide my webcam and start this portion of our webinar. So New Hour for Women and Children Long Island is dedicated to empowering justice-involved women and children. One of the things that kind of got us started on this path was really saying that there is nothing here. There's nothing on the island that is supporting women who've come home. And some of the ways that we do that in terms of our programming is really about supporting mothers. You know, we'll talk a little bit more about the stats for mothers behind bars, but what we do know is that most women behind bars have a child who's impacted. And really, we understand that children and families are the largest percentage of folks who are victimized by the criminal justice system. So we do support women and families through pre and post-release services. We have programs in the jail on Long Island in 2 of the facilities, and then we work with folks as they re-enter. One of the things that prison does is it really does create a divide so that when you come home from being incarcerated, you don't know where to begin. Maybe you've made connections inside of a facility and now you have entered back into the community and you don't have those connections any longer. So one of the things that New Hour is focused on is really making sure that there's a continuity of services for folks who've been impacted, and especially for women. Some of the needs that we address are very much barriers to women who come home, whether it be a ride. You know, Long Island is a place that's long. There are parts of the country where, you know, buses aren't accessible, and on Long Island, it's expensive to take anything other than a bus, and the buses are often unreliable. So we've tried to eliminate barriers to reentry to ensure that women, and the women in these photos here with their children, are all women who've come through New Hour's programming. And we've tried to eliminate those barriers, whether it be volunteers who can help pick women up, transportation to different events, and engaging our formerly incarcerated women and their families in social justice causes. Heading up to Albany, this was the Domestic Violence Survivors Justice Act. I'll talk a little bit more about that campaign when we get into the nitty-gritty. So one of the other things that we really do focus on is Emerge. It's a leadership and advocacy training program for women in reentry. One of the challenging parts of reentry, and for anyone who's a family member or is currently coming home from incarceration, you and the families can feel very much, very alone, and often feel that there is nothing except to either pretend prison or incarceration didn't happen and move on and leave that behind, shut that door, or embrace our experiences and use those experiences to then affect change for other people. So Emerge is our empowering methods for effective reentry growth and engagement. It's a 10-week training module, and we bring speakers each week to talk about a different aspect of reentry. And we know reentry for women is very, very complicated, especially some of our moms have small children. Maybe they've had a child behind bars while they were incarcerated. Maybe they have children who they are now the primary caretaker when they come home. And all of those things make for a challenging reentry experience. So now we're going to talk about what we're here to talk about, which is the nuts and bolts of organizing. And this is something that we talk about in our Emerge training, leadership training program. Directly impacted. Why does your story matter? A lot of us who have experienced having a loved one incarcerated or having ourselves been through the system, we undervalue our experiences. It's very easy to say, well, that happened to me, but it's sad or it's painful, it's challenging, but there's really nothing I can do about it. What we know is that lawmakers, they can argue with a position. You know, if they want to disagree about the death penalty or rights for prisoners, they can, but they can never really argue with your story. Your story is your own, and it is your most powerful tool. You can create empathy and be heard when your story is told. And I'm just going to come back up here for a second because I want to talk a little bit about this piece. When we think about our experiences, it's really easy to say, you know, that experience for me is so triggering and traumatizing, and who wants to hear that? Lawmakers can be persuaded, so don't be afraid to share your story. Your story is unique and it's yours. And what you will notice if you turn on your local news station and start listening. Whenever you hear people who are campaigning, whether it be law enforcement or governors or any elected official, you'll hear them tell stories. They tell little vignettes. They'll tell a story about Joe from Idaho who worked 2 jobs. They tell stories as a way to create buy-in from the community. And you can do that too. You can create that buy-in using your story. So I'm going to talk a little bit about mothers in prison, because often when we talk about prison, we don't talk about women. And while a large percentage of our folks behind bars are men, there are certainly so many women behind bars, and the numbers are growing. 80% of incarcerated women in New York State are mothers, and this percentage has really skyrocketed in the last 30 years, and it continues to climb. The saying goes, when you incarcerate a woman, you incarcerate her whole family. A mother who then is responsible for her children, where those children go and the trajectory of their lives is deeply impacted if they were the primary caretaker for their child. 1.3 million children are affected by a woman's imprisonment, which includes children at home and in the care of someone else, or children born in prisons or jails. And since 1991, the number of women behind bars has doubled who have a minor child under 18 at home. We're going to talk a little bit about dispelling myths and changing minds. So I wanted to give you some concrete examples about how to change the dialogue with powerful people, with lawmakers who have to make decisions about things that will impact your loved ones behind bars or criminal justice reform as a whole. So I wanted to give you the example of New York State's 2009 anti-shackling law. So this law, after much advocacy on my part and many other organizers in the field, it ended the shackling of women around the waist, ankles, and arms while in labor and during transport to labor. This was an archaic and torturous problem, really, that had gone on and took many years to effectively end. It sounds like something that would be easy to end because none of this makes sense. Why would women in labor be shackled? But incarcerated women were, and indeed it caused problems to the children, it caused the death in some instances during childbirth, it caused complications to mothers. And we went to Albany, as we did every year for some 5-10 years working on this, Senator Ruben Diaz Sr., he was a senator, and we sat down with him and we brought a bunch of our women, family members of incarcerated women. And he felt, and he said this to us, listen, I like what you're doing, but I remember drinking when I was young. I remember maybe even smoking pot when I was young. And as soon as I had a child, I just stopped doing that. Now, he had a limited view of and perception of mothers who were impacted by the criminal justice system. And often he's not the only one. Often people view a mother and a woman as being more culpable, and they do judge women often more harshly than men. They feel women maybe are meant to stay home with children and shouldn't get themselves into trouble. One of the things that created the swing vote we needed from him to pass the bill in the Senate was a mother's story. We brought a mother who spoke to him very candidly about losing the rights to her children, about having multiple children and being shackled during the birth of her child. It took her personal story for him to really understand and then become the vote, the very, very last vote needed to make this bill pass. So don't underestimate your story and what it can do. We're going to talk a little bit about external and internal strategies and dig in a little bit more. One of the things that I like to talk about when we talk about external strategies is outside momentum. When we think about a social justice cause, whether it be, ending isolated confinement of prisoners, any prisoner rights issue, there are a couple of ways that you can build outside momentum. And I'm sure a couple of you a bunch of you on the call, on the webinar, are organizers and understand this, but we're going to dig in a little bit. When we talk about mobilizing community events, one of the things that's important is to think about who your community is and what are some of the ways in which they might be impacted and excited. So if you live in a community where you know there is a certain event or something that they take very seriously, maybe a holiday, you want to connect your issue to something that the community will like to see and hear and know about. We're going to talk a little bit about rallies, press conferences, sign-on letters, and social media campaigns. So rallies are interesting. When you think about where to hold a rally, I'll give you an example. We had a bunch of folks who were really, really excited about an issue, and they would hold a rally every Saturday. They'd hold it on the side of the road. They would bring folks there to the rally to stand there, and people pretty much ignored them. They had maybe 10, 15, maybe 20 people. A rally is something that you have to hook into and connect to a current event, or maybe if you have more than 150 people or over 75, a rally only really works when you're able to mobilize media around it and when it makes sense for what's happening in your community. So think in terms of, when we see things on the news where there's very, very large rallies, we have to think about what is the angle that the news reporter is going to report this on. Press conferences happen all the time. We see them often, and they do create momentum because one of the things you can do is get buy-in from local and state and officials across the way to say, let's join together, let's be a part of this press conference, and let's make a group statement. Sign-on letters are very effective. When you have a sign-on letter that's circulating about an issue you care about, and then you're able to take that sign-on letter and say, we have 2,000 organizations that have signed on for this issue. That makes a difference. It adds gravity to the issue you care about. And we'll talk a little bit more about social media campaigns shortly. One of the things to think about when you're talking with local lawmakers or state lawmakers or federal lawmakers, anyone who has decision-making power, It's really important that you be yourself, be genuine, open, honest. People who are in powerful positions, they want to feel that they are helping others, and they want to know that you're being genuine and honest with them. So if they ask you a question and you don't know the answer, it's important to say, hey, I don't know the answer to that, but I will find out and get back to you. If there are concerns that they raise, we had a senator who said to us, you know, if you were able to pass this anti-shackling bill and, you know, women were not able to be shackled during labor, what happens when a woman decides that she's going to run away from the hospital? And while that's slightly laughable for any of us who have experienced childbirth, it's important to take into consideration their concerns and be honest with them about what you think about their concerns, talking back. Even if this is an issue that's really, really charged for you, it's very triggering. You are dealing with tremendous injustice. Maybe your loved one has been in isolated confinement for 30 days and it's really egregious. It's important to temper that with a level-headed approach to make sure that they hear you and that they don't feel that they're being attacked or you're coming at them in an angry manner. So understanding the players, we're going to talk a little bit about players, meaning folks who are decision makers and who they are and what their role is. When you think about, I'm going to use this example, the Domestic Violence Survivors Justice Act, which just passed this session, very exciting. We worked for 10 years, and really what this bill does is it allows judges to have additional discretion when they are sentencing a woman who has fought back against an abuser and committed a crime as a result, or maybe it's a woman who, or man, any domestic violence survivor who has been coerced into committing a crime because of the abuse. Often before this, what would happen is there was mandatory minimum sentences for crimes, and very often why a person who suffered from domestic violence, the survivor of abuse, why they engaged in criminal behaviors was not really thought about in terms of what impact a abuser had on them. So when you think about who you would want to identify, so you've got to pull together, and you probably have already, your working group of advocates. Maybe you meet monthly, maybe you meet weekly, maybe you get on a phone call. However you get together, you want an active group of working advocates. It could be you and your brother, sister, and your neighbors, and you get on that phone call. Consistency is important. So make regular meetings and meet in the community with decision makers. So you may decide you're going to take 4 people and every week go to a different local county legislator. And when you go, you want to be very clear about what your ask is. Are you asking them to support a bill? Are you asking them to overhaul a system? Are you asking them for mental health care for a loved one? What is your ask, and how can you make it easy for them to understand your ask? One of the things that we've, myself, the Coalition for Women Prisoners, the Correctional Association, the Anti-Shackling Committee, many folks from many different organizing groups came together and said, let's take a look at who might be the most influential people in terms of this issue. Now, if this issue, in our case, was about giving judicial discretion to judges, we went to the National Association of Women Judges. We went to local law enforcement, local community groups, the New York Junior League, which happens to be women who are very engaged in New York City. This group was very engaged. They were women who wanted to make a difference in their community, and we gave them a pitch. We said, listen, this is an issue we're looking to pass. Is this something that you would be interested in supporting? And it's not necessarily easy. Some of these conversations with these groups took a long time. For instance, the National Association of Women Judges is made up of judges. So they had a lot of questions about how the bill would be implemented once it became law. And different layers of jurisdiction and discretion in the bill. Being able to answer those questions for them is really important, and it gives you more power thinking about what you can do to strengthen your issue. So now I'm going to talk about the internal factor, the inside game, which is interestingly often much more important than the rallies and the press conferences and the kind of all of the bigger stuff. When you have a small strategic meeting, a meeting with a lawmaker, a person who locally knows somebody, you can affect real change. I'm just going to pause this 1 second here. I'm sorry about that. I have an alarm going off. One of the things that I want to point out is if you have a board member, somebody who maybe has a long-standing relationship. In this photo, you'll see this happens to be one of New Hour's board members, the woman on your left, and in the middle is Senator Gorin, a newly elected senator to the New York State Senate. She has known him and developed a relationship with him for many, many years. And so it was really easy for her to call him up and say, would you come to my house? That's her house. And we'll have tea and talk a little bit about some of the issues we care about. He stayed for a long time. He drank his tea. He asked thoughtful questions. And it really created an environment where he was able to really hear some of the asks that we had for him. In particular, we were talking with him about isolated confinement and why long sentences for prisoners really do not work and are not helpful in terms of reentry. And he had a lot of questions and thoughts, and what you might want to think about, well, you could say, I don't know anybody who has any power or influence. You'd be surprised, using social media, we'll talk about again, you'd be surprised how many people know someone. You might know someone, in your local community, maybe it's a pastor, maybe it's, you've gone to X amount of events at a particular organization. You'd be surprised when you start to kind of pull together who knows people, that everyone is really connected, and you will find ways to mobilize your community. Now, if you are running a nonprofit and you do have board members, the best thing you can do is make sure that you engage them and you ask them who they know. A funny story, one of our board members said, oh, I don't know anybody. There's nobody I know who can help raise money for this organization. I have very little that I can offer. But in a longer conversation with that board member, it came out that she really did know quite a few people, but she had never asked them for help with any of the issues that we were working on. Now, once you've created internal supports and power, that's when you begin to move towards what's outside pressure. What are your external ways that you're going to impact change? Your rallies, your press conferences, your sign-on letters, once you've kind of put your ducks in a row in terms of your inside game. One of the questions we often ask ourselves and is asked across the board, how do I identify key targets? How do I know if somebody is going to be the right person on an issue? An example of this, we have a senator here in our area who was newly elected as well to the New York State Senate, and she's been a long supporter of community activities. We live in her district, so we visit her office, we bring in brochures, we talk to her about events, we try to find ways to connect with her, and yet her office was focused mostly on immigration reform. Well, in talking with her, it turns out that she is the child of immigrant parents, and she really was able to make the connection to our issues when we raised the concerns that we had about children who have an incarcerated parent. Children who have an incarcerated parent suffer the same levels of trauma as a child who's lost their parent to death or something other than that. And in talking with her, it was discovered that she really had a soft spot in her heart for children whose parents had been deported, for children who she was able to make that connection from her own personal life to our issue. And that is invaluable. You want to take a look at the biographies online. You want to take a look at their social media pages for your senators or lawmakers, whoever that person is. It could be a local restaurateur. Everything is online now. So be strategic. Learn who this person is and what makes them really engage in terms of an issue. That's how you'll be most effective. So I want to bring an example to you about the right partners to bring to the table. It's often confusing when you think about who are the movers and shakers around an issue. An example of this, in 2010, one of the bills that we worked to advocate for when I was at the Correctional Association was the Adoption and Safe Families Expanded Discretion Law. At the time, before it became law, it was the Adoption and Safe Families Expanded Discretion Act. And what this law, when it passed, did was we saw that there was a whole lot of discrimination happening around children who the rights to their, the parents who the rights to their children were being terminated. Caseworkers would find out that the parent had a year in prison to do, 18 months in prison, and all of a sudden they would move to terminate the parental rights because they would feel that once a parent was incarcerated, they really didn't have a chance at creating a meaningful relationship with their child. What we were arguing is that you can certainly have meaningful relationships with your child, whether you're incarcerated or not, and there are lots of ways to document that. One of the people who we reached out to was the former Commissioner Gladys Carrion at OCFS, Office of Children and Family Services. And it was her job to ensure that children were placed in safe homes and permanent homes because children were languishing in foster care. And that there was a real move to move children out of foster care and into permanent homes, which in essence is a really important and good, well-intentioned thought. However, what would happen is caseworkers were very quickly moving to terminate parental rights forever, where a birth parent had no rights to know where their child was or what happened. So they became incarcerated, and as a result of incarceration, they lost all contact with their children. One of the things we were able to do is harness her, Commissioner Carrion. We were able to talk with her and understand that what's in the best interest of a child is important, whether it be that plan for permanency could potentially be moving that child back to be reunited with a parent who is home and doing well and stable. So she understood and became aware of the process for parents and the bias against parents behind bars. And she really became a true advocate for us on this issue. Never underestimate the power of local relationships. We talked a little bit about this before. One thing that you can do is call your local legislators. Most of the time, you don't realize that they have to listen to you. They are hired by you. Essentially, you voted them into office. So if you live in their district, you should be showing up at least once every couple weeks. If you have a pertinent issue that you really care about, you want to be calling their office and say, hey, I'm a constituent. I'd like to come in and talk with the lawmaker about this. Now, they can avoid you. They can refuse to meet with you. You can make sure when you get there, you sign into that little sign-in book and you show up. Another thing that you can do is follow them on social media. Sometimes this is painful because their opinions may be very different than yours, but the more you're able to voice your opinion respectfully and thoughtfully, the more it adds to a broader conversation about the issues you care about. One of the things that we talk about a lot in organizing is documenting your ask. If you call every day, it's not necessarily that somebody has to document that you called, but if you are putting your ask in writing, it can't be ignored. And so you should write op-eds, write to your local paper, write to your elected official, and state what you need and why you need it and why it's important. The other thing that we often forget about is when you've finished a meeting with a lawmaker, it's easy to say thanks so much and we'll be in touch. One of the things that goes a long way is write a note of thanks, post something on social media thanking them. Make sure to thank them in a way that they hear and see from you, because this will go a long way in building relationship with them, especially when it comes to future asks. On the right of the screen, she's got kind of like a flowered shirt on. That's Senator Montgomery in New York State. She was the key senator to carry this bill around the anti-shackling law I talked about. Legislative time frame is really, really important to think about. We often get overwhelmed thinking that it's, taking too long to pass legislation, but legislation typically takes 5 to 10 years. Now, there's exceptions to that rule, but for instance, this is an external event. We had a rally here. At this point, we had folks from different organizations. They had stuffed pillows in their stomachs to simulate being pregnant, and they had very visible handcuffs on. So when Governor Patterson from New York State pulled up, and this was right outside of his office, after we had created all of the internal organizing, we then created this external. We had a press conference and then held this public statement. So when he pulled up, the bill had already moved through the Senate and the Assembly. The bill was just basically waiting for his signature to pass into law. And when he pulled up and saw this group, he had to come up quickly with a response. And thankfully, his response was to sign the bill into law. But this is an example of an external measure of power and influence. All right. So when we talk about social media, I want to kind of dig in a little bit here. Don't undervalue what social media can do. Often decision makers are online. They're looking at social media. They're looking at their page. They're looking at other people's pages. Their staff are looking at pages. So be careful. Be careful what you're saying, because anything that's put on social media is admissible in a court of law, and people forget that. We think it's very easy to kind of blow off some steam, put something down because we're rightfully enraged. Anything that's said out there is there permanently. And so if you want to encourage a dialogue and a discourse with a lawmaker, you really don't want to create inflammatory comments. Now, there is a difference between inflammatory comments and stating the truth as you see it, but you want to be thoughtful about, is this something that I'm okay with seeing in 10 years from now or 2 months from now? Because once it's out there forever. We talked a little bit about penning an op-ed to the editorial board. One of the things about this is, surprisingly, people still read the newspaper. And if they don't read the newspaper, they read the newspaper that's posted on Facebook. So when you write to your local editorial board an opinion piece, it is often taken seriously. It may show both sides of the issue, or it may show a particular point of view, but op-eds do go a long way and people talk about them. And that's really important to think about and to use. We're going to move into questions and answers now. I'm going to put my self back up on the screen here for you. And I think Jeanette will kind of go through some of the questions and answers we have here.
Hi, so I'm Victoria. I'm not Jeanette, but I thought I would jump on and invite people to submit questions. if you look on the right side of your screen, you have there's space for you to enter questions for everybody who's watching the webinar. The reason I actually asking you a question. We've known each other a long time, but I'm a big fan of your work and your advocacy. And I was wondering if you could like back up a little bit and talk about with the anti-shackling bill. Like, how did you know? Because I know it gets very confusing, right? How did you know you're seeing like women get shackled in a jail in a local jurisdiction? Like, how did you know it was a state issue? How did you know who in the state legislature might be the right person to bring a bill forward? Like, can you walk us through that a little bit? Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question, Tori. So one of the things that we were finding was women would write to us. We were at the Correctional Association, and they would write from the 5 prisons across the state and tell us egregious stories of being shackled in labor. And we also, those of us who were formerly incarcerated, had witnessed with our own eyes experiences of terrible trauma at the hands of corrections because of this law. So it was something that had gone on for many decades, and that is there were also a series of lawsuits because of deaths of infants or major health issues to women, and it became an issue just organically in terms of what it was that people were complaining about. You know, we see this with folks who are on strike and not eating in certain facilities because of poor treatment or poor medical care. Medical care is historically one of the biggest challenges for folks who are behind bars, and unfortunately that hasn't changed in as many decades. It's been 2 decades that I've been working on this, and it's even gotten worse. So when we looked at Senator Montgomery, who was one of the folks who championed this in the Senate, she headed up the Children and Families Committee. So you want to take a look at which committees your bill or your issue might really be impacted by, or which committees are going to have to vote on your bill. So if your bill in New York State Senate has anything to do with corrections, it would be folks who are part of the Crime Victims and Corrections Committee. This bill in turn had to do with mothers and children, so hence Children and Families Committee. Elder care, people aging in prison, there's a committee that looks at the aging. And so you would want to think about which committees your issue would end up going through. And then you want to target every single committee member who is a part of that committee, whether they be Republican or Democrat, and you want to meet with them, you want to push your materials over to them, you want to talk to their staff, you want to engage them in dialogue, you want to invite them to local town halls. It's what is it? The squeaky wheel gets the oil. So they have a lot of issues that are coming at them from different constituents, and often constituents who have a lot more money and power than local grassroots organizers. So you need to stay consistent, and that's really, really important.
Great.
I just want to say congratulations, because convincing Reverend Ruben Diaz is not easy.
Who was my representative at the time?
How difficult it is to convince him. So congratulations.
Yes. So we have some questions. We have some questions.
Great.
But we can circle back to Ruben Diaz Sr. if that's necessary. So we have a question. I have a husband who has been incarcerated for 35 years and was recently sent off for another 10 years. My question to you all is that here in Alaska, we have no idea how to get our voices heard or how to get a group of loved ones together to be able to start and speak about the things happening here in Alaska. Any suggestions would be greatly appreciated. And I'll just add to that, as you're responding, maybe also, because we're aware that people are all over the country, and including in states that are kind of Republican-led, where it might be a little more difficult to make traction than it is in New York.
One of the interesting things with the rise of Facebook is that it is relatively easy to create your own Facebook page, your own Facebook group. And interestingly, we've seen the kind of creation of Facebook and groups in Facebook build power. And so, in Alaska, you may have long miles between each other. You can all be part of the same Facebook group and continue to think about how you want to build power. So how do you want to create materials after you've had an ongoing dialogue? Materials that you would then send, a statement of rights for prisoners. You may want to think about what are the mandatory things that you want to have happen and begin with a Facebook group. It sounds really simple, but interestingly, it works.
Okay. I just want to make an invitation on behalf of Justice for Families. Grace Bauer-Lubau is the executive director, and she's here, but she's muted, and we can't see her right now. But I feel like she would be comfortable with me making the offer that folks in Alaska should please reach out to the organization, because we want to support you. We know you're far, but we care about your family, you and your families, and we want to help you in your organizing effort. We have a question that's more of a comment. It's just a comment, but we have been lobbying for 8 years to pass juvenile justice bills in Florida, which have finally made it through several committees, with one last hurdle in these last 2 weeks of the Florida session. Your guidance and leadership is wonderful. Thank you. Well, thank you.
That's great.
It's very exciting to see Florida making change. So, Jeanette, do you want to read the next question we have?
If you on the part about when you actually made a policy, wait, let me go back. If you can go back on the part about when you actually met with a policymaker, legislator, what was the suggestion on the departure again?
What was the suggestion on the
Departure.
Yeah, it sounds like maybe the delivery, or like the interaction, or
How was how did the meeting end?
Right.
Yeah.
So I'll go back to Senator Ruben Diaz, and I also want to make a comment, senior, because Senator Diaz Jr. was very different than his father. But on the comment about Florida, now that you've moved into a critical time, that this time in Florida, in terms of juvenile justice, is where you pull all stops out. You create those op-eds, you create that massive amount of external pressure. It's easy to ignore things until the Women's March happens. You have thousands of people coming together stating, hey, women's rights matter. Now would be the time to think about how to mobilize in a big way in Florida. And I'm sure you know this already, but I'm excited for you guys in Florida. In terms of the departure piece, one of the interesting things about Senator Diaz Sr. is he sat there, his arms were crossed, he was not willing to hear what we had to say. He did stay with us. That's something that not all lawmakers will do. He sat with us for over 35 minutes. He explained why he felt so seriously about his opinion. If you can get a lawmaker to engage with you, even if they don't agree with you, and even if they're stating something other, but you're engaging, you're having that conversation with them, and you're bringing emotion to the table out of them, you can then move to how you feel and how you want to impact them. He listened for a long time, and finally he said to one of our women, wow, I never knew it was so complicated. I never understood why women would use substances and be substance abusers after they had children. You really shared from your heart. And she was genuine, she was honest, she looked him straight in the eye, she talked to him as a human being, and he heard her. And so by the end of that meeting, he didn't promise us he was going to vote in favor, but he said, I understand more about why women are impacted. And sometimes it just takes a long conversation or a series of conversations. And lawmakers need to know what your story is. That's the power of story. You do not ever underestimate the power of your story.
Can I ask a question? Was that the first meeting that you had with Ruben Diaz Sr.? Or was
So
that
we
like after a series of meetings that you had had?
We had a few meetings in his district before then. The meeting where that culminated in him kind of seeing our point of view was a very large lobby day. So we brought 300 families and directly impacted folks to Albany. We flooded Albany with members, and everyone who was there in terms of assembly members and senators knew that the Coalition for Women Prisoners was there, and we couldn't be ignored. So there is something to be said for turning out in numbers. If you're going to go and lobby, you can have small conversations, inside conversations with chief of staffs and with, folks who are debating the issues and bill drafters. But if you want to have full impactful change after you've created the groundwork, that's when you bring in kind of the larger group, and you bring in folks with direct experiences who can really go toe to toe with a lawmaker who needs to be persuaded.
Serena, could you speak a little bit to us about elections? It seems to be something that, especially about the role for people who may not be able to vote in elections, but about electoral politics and the role that you see that having in this kind of advocacy.
Yeah, that's a great question. Especially now, it's such a charged issue because so many folks are left out of elections, including folks behind bars who've been convicted, who should be able to vote. And so that voter disenfranchisement is a big issue. One of the things to remember about elections is that lawmakers are going to vote in a way that they think will get them more votes in the future. So if I am a senator and everyone in my district voted for me because I'm a conservative on an issue, and I voted in support of the death penalty, I know that if I have folks in my neighborhood who are coming to my office and they're telling me, I live in your district, and next time I go to vote, I'm going to realize where you stand on this issue. A lot of times, and I'm talking about folks who can vote, a lot of times lawmakers aren't asked how they feel about criminal justice issues. Sometimes they don't know anything about criminal justice issues and no one's asking them about it. So even if you can't vote, you can still show up to their office. You can ask for a meeting with them and ask, hey, what's your position on the death penalty? What's your position on women behind bars? What's your position on children who have a parent incarcerated? And oftentimes lawmakers will say, nobody's ever actually come to me with that question before. I don't know. I have to find out. I don't know where I stand on that. I didn't know that's an issue that people care about.
That's a really great point.
I want to share something. When I was campaigning for a local senator here in my community, even before I even knew as much as I know about juvenile justice and the amount of money that goes invested in incarcerating our young people, I asked him a question. I wanted to know what was his platform on juvenile justice, and he wasn't clear. And once I compelled my story, because now I became that parent with a child in the system, he embraced that platform, and he said, I'm going to do as much as I can to support these families. And as a registered voter, we need to hold our politicians accountable. We need to also share that. I said in my household alone, I have 7 votes, 7 registered voters. So use that as also a strategy to kind of have these politicians listen to our concerns, because we do vote.
Absolutely. And I think the thing to be added to that is, I didn't mention this in the PowerPoint, and in retrospect, I should have. Once a bill becomes something that the governor can weigh in on, oftentimes with juvenile justice reform, I didn't talk about Raise the Age, which was one of the campaigns that we worked on here really furiously to pass, making sure that 16 and 17-year-olds weren't incarcerated with adults. Actually, as of October of next year, 17-year-olds will no longer be incarcerated with adults. And most of the women who I was in prison with when I was 19 were 16 and 17. And I can say very clearly that we, as young people, even up to 21, and even psychologists are showing up to age 26, the development of the brain is really decision-making doesn't happen the same way it happens after that age. But Governor Cuomo, at the time when he saw that this bill to keep kids out of prison was gaining momentum, he suddenly realized that he was going to do his best to create a campaign around it. And he sent folks from his office to meet with our young people. So we gathered young people who had written their stories about being in prison and jail and being treated very badly and abused and harmed and left with serious trauma for the rest of their lives. And we created a vehicle for those stories to be told in a PR campaign that he launched, which was, statewide. The commercials came out. Having a face, and as you say, Jeanette, being that face sometimes is scary. We think, what are people going to think about me? What are they going to think about my crime? What are they going to think about my family? How is this going to impact my other children or my loved ones? It's really important to be brave, to step forward and to say, if I can serve a purpose here in debunking the myth of who someone is who's behind bars, or who someone is who's a family member, it's really important that it humanizes the issue. And that's ultimately what passed Raise the Age, was bringing the young people who were 16 and 17 to the table to say, I suffered because of current laws and they need to change.
And just to veggie back on what you're saying, I don't eat no meat, so I say veggie back. I presented in front of city council about I, as a parent, having a 16-year-old in an adult prison and him experiencing all this abuse, that if he was home and I would have done half of those things, I would have been arrested.
Absolutely.
So I'm excited that law was changed.
Yeah.
I'm afraid we've hit 9 o'clock. So
And
Jeanette,
you mentioned the Women's March. I just want to throw in an amazing organizer who's on the webinar also as a participant. Carmen Perez was one of the most amazing women leading that march, organizing millions of women across the country to rally for women. So thank you, Carmen. We
yeah, thank you.
are honored, and I truly appreciate you.
Wonderful. So we have one last comment. Just as a note, we did get a comment from Carmen, a yes. So that's like not a question, but a comment.
I was messaging Carmen private.
And then we have a final comment. Maybe this can close us out, but a final comment from Florida, saying thank you again. You fueled us to keep our momentum up in Florida. So Serena, your message about not
You froze, Vicky. So will you come back?
Was heard all the way down in Florida.
On behalf of Grace Bauer and the Justice for Families team, we want to thank you, Serena. I know this is not saying bye. We want to bring you back. We're family, so you ain't going nowhere.
That's right.
Thank you so much for your insight, your expertise, your lived experience.
Happy to be here.
It does says a lot. Sometimes I myself felt embarrassed sharing my story, having a kid in the system. My youngest. I didn't want to say anything in first couple of weeks, but I said if I don't say something, I can become part of the problem. So I had to do something about it, and I saw the bigger picture, that it was just not my kid; it was too many kids. And you saw another picture. You saw too many women.
Yes.
There's a lot of issues and there's a lot of concerns happening in the juvenile and the adult system. So I know that it takes time, but we can't give up. Someone said 8 years, 10 years, but when we stay consistent and we continue fighting and we continue bringing more families and more community members, and sometimes you just don't know, and just bringing the information can enlighten us on what we can do, whether it's a phone call, giving out flyers, cooking a meal for a group. So there's something that everyone can do when it comes to fighting for justice.
Yeah, I'm honored to have been on this call. I know we're out of time. I would say really it goes back to being brave and being really thoughtful about how your story can change so many other people's lives. So it's important to not feel, listen, we're living in an era of mass incarceration. We say it all the time. But if we aren't able to talk to our neighbors and our friends and our family about what incarceration, what that impact has been, we're really selling ourselves short. So I'm happy to be here and thank you.
No, thank you.
Wonderful.
Oh my gosh. So, Vicky, can you put the slides with the contact information? Again, on behalf of Justice for Families, Grace Bauer, Susan Bedell, Victoria Sorrentino, our special guest, Serena Longori, and myself, Jeanette, we want to thank everyone for signing in, staying on. I know that for some of us it's late, so thank you again. But you know what? It's a long weekend. Good Friday. Some of us will not be working, some of us will. So the contact information is there. We do provide leadership trainings. We do assessments with systems this month. Good night.
Thank you all. Good night.